Close brace. For JavaScript developers, by JavaScript developers. Alright, we're back and ready to start building what we need for a login page. First, let's use our new Bootstrap capabilities to make our navigation a little less terrible. We're going to add a React strap navbar to our header, complete with toggling for small displays, which will allow us to cover two things we haven't touched on yet: React classes and component state. Fair warning, this tutorial runs a little long, but I felt it'd be more confusing to throw a bunch of code at you in this tutorial and then actually explain the code in the second one. So, buckle in. First thing we need to do is a little housekeeping. We're duplicating a plugin right now in our Babel config and our Webpack config, and it can lead to some state issues. So open .babelrc, and just delete this line entirely. And that's it. Just save the file, and we're good. Now open /source/components/shared/header.jsx. Let's make some changes. Below line 2, add the following. As you can see, we're pulling in a whole bunch of stuff from React Strap that we're going to use to assemble our navbar. Now, here's where things change significantly. In order to make toggling work, we need to use an existing method that's only available to React classes, not pure functions like we have here. So it's time to build our first one of those. Here's what I recommend. You should add a few line breaks above line 4, and then write out the entire new class above it. That way you can compare the two and note differences between the function and the class. We're going to be using ES6 classes here. They're pretty straightforward, but we should talk about them a little bit. Classes are special objects that basically put a new layer over JavaScript's existing prototype-based inheritance. That makes things a little easier to work with. They're great for defining an object, in this case a React component, and making it clear how inheritance works. Classes can extend other classes, which means they get all of the parent class's existing methods and other parameters, but can also add their own, which don't get passed up to the parent. In this case, we're extending React's component class, which means we get a bunch of handy methods like setState, which we'll be using today, various lifecycle methods like componentWillMount that we'll be covering in later tutorials, and more. Let's start by declaring our new class. It's not that different from our function declaration. Here it is. As you can see, we've swapped function out for class, and we're extending React.component. Okay, fair enough. Now let's add some lines at the top of the class. Alright, that might be mildly alarming. A class constructor tells the class what arguments the class can take. It's similar to defining function arguments like this, except we're doing it inside the class declaration. Alright, let's get rid of this. In most cases, inside a constructor, you then need to assign the arguments to this.whatever name you like. So you'd expect there to be a line like this. But there's not. That's because the actual next line, superProps, is taking the assignments from the parent class, React.component. In order to use this properly in a child class, you need to call super in the constructor. All of this is higher level than we can really dive into in this tutorial, so if you want more information, I once again recommend Wes Boss's ES6 for Everyone, which has an entire section on classes. It's a great set of courses, and I'll link it in the YouTube description. Moving on, we see that we're setting a state variable for our class. This is the only place you should ever manipulate this.state directly. In all other cases, you'll use a special setState method, which we'll get to. In our case, we're just setting a variable called isOpen to false. This will control whether or not the navbar starts out expanded or collapsed on small screens. We want it to be collapsed. Doing this in the constructor means that this.state and this.state.isOpen will be available anywhere else within the class that we want to use it. That'll come in handy later. Alright, let's talk state. We covered app state a while back in 5-Minute React 29. App state is different from component state. The former contains data available application-wide. The latter controls the particular state of bits and pieces of a given component. As a general rule of thumb, if it's coming in from your database, it should be stored in app state. If it's just visual toggles like a navbar expanding or collapsing, that's a good candidate for component state. We'll use both types of state a lot in this app, giving you plenty of chances to learn the difference. Alright, add a line break for some spacing, and then add this code to your class. Here we create a render method, which React will run automatically when it mounts the component, that returns a whole bunch of JSX, most of it comprised of the various components we imported from React Strap. This is going to give us a Bootstrap navbar that will say music list in the upper left and have a login link in the upper right, the latter of which will be hidden on small displays unless the user clicks a menu button. A few things to note. On line 18, we're calling a this.toggle navbar method when a user clicks. Observant viewers might note that we have not actually defined that method yet. We'll fix that in a second. Also note that on line 20, we're using this.state.isOpen, which means that if we toggle that value in our state, the value will change in React, which will cause a redraw, changing the classes necessary to expand or collapse the menu. Cool. Alright, let's add our toggle method. Above the render block, but below the constructor, add the following code. As you can see from this in the render method, we don't have to use the function declaration or anything in ES6 classes. It's just the method name and some parens, which would contain arguments if we needed them, but here we don't. So there's how setState works. You just pass it an object with any parts of the component state you want to manipulate, and it'll do so. This is nice because it means you could have, say, 5 parameters defined in this.state, but only manipulate 2 of them using a particular setState command, and the other 3 just stay as they were. Due to React's auto magic, this also triggers a component re-render, which is one of the reasons why you'll always want to use setState rather than manually changing this.state. Alright, seems like we should be done, but we're not. Helper methods like toggle navbar have to be bound in our constructor. There's a big, long reason for this, but the shorter version is that if you don't bind them, React will basically create a new instance of toggle navbar every time the component re-renders. But when you click on the toggle, it'll be running the old instance of toggle navbar attached to the old version of the component, which no longer exists. That'll throw an error. It's a little confusing, but the long and short of it is, we need this line up in our constructor just above this.state. Cool. Now we're all set. Except of course we need to delete the old header function. Remember, it's still down here. Do that whenever you've compared it to the class and feel comfortable that you understand the differences. Oops, and we're missing a semicolon. Alright, save this file, and let's head over to localhost port 3000. You may need to hard refresh because we made those changes to .eslint.rc. There we go. You should have a fully working navbar, and you can resize your browser down to see the toggle functioning properly as well. Great! Now we have our navbar. In the next tutorial, we'll make that login link actually go somewhere.